Speaking about dude,
Family friend.
we're live.
You heard me, Toby.
You always have an answer.
I try.
Wait, so you're telling me that I... He's out of the office today.
Well, he's
Yeah,
like
with
trying to
Mr.
crush
Bob,
all
we're gonna
my
begin.
hopes and dreams in an email exchange.
Yes, Creasy, I'm about to begin. Are you ready?
Sure. We are at 5 o'clock. I know Mr. Palmer is not going to be with us this evening. Mr. Sully Yates did notify that he will be, so I'm sure he is running on in, but you do have quorum.
Right. Alrighty, good evening, and I think we're ready to begin our deliberations for the evening. This will be a work session. Just for your information, we will not be taking public comment from Zoom or from the floor, but we will take public comment via email. So Ms. Creasy will give you her email address, and she'll give you the address that public comments need to go to. There are basically two things that we really need to do tonight. We need to give the NDS staff direction, and very direct direction. Not specific, because we're not going to write the zoning ordinance for them, but we want them to give them a good general idea of where we're going to go with the anti-displacement zones. That used to be called these sensitive zones. We need to give staff a good idea of where we want to go. If we are not able to reach consensus, what I will end up having to do is ask for a vote on what may be some options that Mr. Freeze will give us. The other piece is the special exemption process. We need to give Mr. Freeze and his group direction on what we want to do with that. And once again, hopefully there'll be consensus. If not, we'll have to take a vote. And with that, I think, Mr. Freeze, you have the ball.
Let me just give
Mr.
quick
Christie, you want-
logistics. So as the chair noted, we aren't going to have verbal comments from the public, but we are taking written comments, and any written comments we receive during the meeting will be attached to the minutes. Individuals can email me at creasym@charlottesville.gov. Emails have started to come. Also, for our in-person audience, we have cards and pens if you would like to provide written comments instead of email comments. That is an option as well. I think that's it from a logistics standpoint.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Good evening. So as noted, our goal for this evening was to hit on some of what we know are kind of the bigger topics that you guys are still looking at as we look towards finishing this work up. The Two of those that we've identified for this evening are the, what was formerly called the sensitive community areas, now is anti-displacement overlay, and then special exceptions for form standards, something that came up, I believe, at one of your more recent meetings. So I'm going to start, and this is not a presentation, as much as the room is set up for this to be a presentation, right? So I'm hoping that this can be more of a conversation. But I think the first kind of threshold question when we think about the anti-displacement overlay district is whether or not to have one. I'm going to highlight some of the issues around that, and then I anticipate a conversation amongst y'all and amongst all of us in that area. But one thing I wanted to note, I'm hoping everyone had an opportunity to review the RKG study that was in your packets for the public hearing last week? Yeah. Last week. I know when this came up at the Housing Advisory Committee and at the Housing Advisory Committee, there was a lot of concern around the RA and the sense that there were a number of, the most attractive areas would potentially be those areas that are at risk of displacement in the RA. But also note that when we added in the analysis of the RB and the RC districts, and remember that there were no RB and RC districts in our designated sensitive community areas, that part of the role of the medium intensity of the RB and the RC districts was to actually draw some of that new development away. That was part of the anti-displacement strategy, is to create opportunities for new development in other parts of the city that haven't necessarily seen that type of development in the past. Still do it in a way that was sensitive to the scale and context of those places, but identify places that had access to amenities like parks and transit and schools and so on, and allow for a certain amount of density to happen in those areas. And what I note is that our rate of change analysis did in fact show that is working, that there are going to be units that are drawn to those locations. So part of what we identified early on in the concept of addressing the issue of displacement is in fact bearing out, at least in the results of this model. But to come back to this question again around doing an overlay, I think there's a number of pros and cons there, and you guys have heard me a number of times identify where our concerns are on staff, in the notion that anything we do that reduces the potential for development in the areas certainly reduces that potential for displacement, but also reduces that potential for additional value for those homes and those properties. And that's something I think we need to continue to bear in mind. And then also recognizing that there's nothing we can do to stop the single unit, the single family flips that we know are occurring in those areas, that those are going to be part of what has happened and is leading today to the displacement those neighborhoods are experiencing and will continue to happen going forward. And then also thinking about the RKG study, remember the limitations of that study, because it does not take into account the actual characteristics of the lot. That was beyond the capacity of what could be accomplished in that work. The other thing I'd note is, as again you guys have heard me talk about a number of times, our goal is to come back at a future date with both an anti-displacement strategy, conversation that we've opened with the Housing Advisory Committee, and clearly more work needs to be done on that, and to come back with our first small area plan following this project being in the 10th and Page neighborhood. So a lot of the conversation has been about how a anti-displacement strategy in the space could be a bridge between the adoption of the zoning ordinance and an adoption of a more specific, a more tailored set of recommendations towards this issue in both that neighborhood and other parts of the city. So I'm going to leave it there. No, I haven't necessarily said much new, but I thought it was all relevant to the conversation and worth kind of putting on the table again.
Let me just ask a general question to make sure that we're all on the same page. Do we all believe that the anti-displacement overlay is necessary? Is there anyone that doesn't believe that it is necessary?
In the form of a zoning overlay, I don't believe that it's necessary.
Okay. Mr. Schwartz.
I think I'm more concerned about the periphery of these neighborhoods than putting a zoning. I'm more concerned about affecting the zoning of the periphery than affecting the zoning of the neighborhoods themselves. So as in like looking at the zoning of Preston and Cherry versus changing the zoning inside the neighborhoods.
I'll let you get Mr. DeBronzio.
So, a zoning overlay, is it necessary? Well, that depends on what else we do, or don't do, or recommend. The hack essentially offered, in, I don't know how closely those recommendations review,
Let me hold
two
up.
options
Let me
for
ask
that.
you to hold up
Yeah.
just things. I'm going to ask you to actually go into detail about that because I think,
Yeah.
In what you guys wrote, there may be a way to land the plane. But
Well, and there's a third one too, but just to say, some of those don't involve an actual overlay, and there's an option that may not. So I'd be happy to talk through them, but is it absolutely necessary? No. Does the second point that the hack made in the recommendations about if we do, this is why we need one and why it will work? Yes.
okay.
So,
Yeah. All right.
but yeah,
I've gone back and forth a lot on this, and I think if there's a way to cater them per neighborhood, then yes, we can do that. But as a general broad stroke across all neighborhoods, I don't think it's necessary at this time.
Mr. Gates.
I have given this a great deal of thought. I see many potential ways forward. At this time, as part of this process, I could see it working if it is part of a citywide anti-displacement effort in all zones, so that it is consistent and we can defend it in court. If it is not citywide, I would recommend that it be separate and on a different timeline, so that we can study it in more detail.
That is pretty consistent with my thinking as well. I don't think that we need an overlay in a certain section of the city. I do think that some sort of protections need to be in place, and separate on a different timeline seems sort of reasonable to me. But Mr. Freeze, yeah.
All right, I'm processing.
While you're
Yeah.
processing, would you like me to go to Mr. DeBronzio? Because they had two different proposals.
Yeah.
One that I think may have some legal issues, and the other one that is pretty soft. You want to walk us through
Sure,
that?
All right, so-
that sounds great. Can I just, and
Sure.
can I invite after that, Commissioner Solowitz, do you have anything in mind when you think about citywide? 'Cause that.
Check your email.
What's that?
Check your email.
Well, tell us what you.
Well, let's, I mean,
Yeah,
I was going to give him
tell
a
us what
moment
you
to.
wrote.
I will.
Thank you.
So, when the hack looked at this, we had, I mean, there's a lot of room for further discussion on this point in the hack, obviously. The concern, and we saw the replacement rate of, the rate of change analysis too, and it does have some issues that might knock the data sideways. But having said all that, so option A was to look at something similar, and the analogy I draw is something similar to the subdivision rules in some rural counties, family subdivision rules. So in family subdivision rules, when you have a chunk of dirt and you want to divide it and it's not zoned for easy division, you can give it to a family member, provided you have owned it for X period of time, and the recipient of the gifted carved off 2-acre plot at the end has to hold title for a certain period of time before they can subdivide it or sell it. And so to take that concept this way, the suggestion would be to say, to sort of season titling, by which I mean, in these sensitive areas, if we identify them, if we had a way to say, all right, in order to move forward with development on a given lot, you have to have been on title for 2 years. The idea behind that is that, I mean, and that would be effective from day one. So everyone who lives in these areas would be able to develop immediately. But if they sold to a developer, that developer would have to sit. And the idea there would just be to put a break. Now, I threw this at Jay on Thursday evening, and to sort of get the essence of our conversation, his sort of professional off-the-cuff opinion was, that ain't gonna work. He thinks it's a takings, but he's still looking at it. The second option was to have a sensitive area overlay, maybe with the sunset edge, that allows up to 3-year units per lot, provided at least the first extra unit is affordable from day one, to sort of make the development easy, a little shortened there. And then, allow up to 4 if the unit is affordable and the original structure is maintained, allow 1 unit per lot by right. In other words, so you're saying you sort of create a de facto new zone of RA minus, and there would be 1 unit unless you're building affordable on it. That has its own problems. The third thing that has just sort of sprung at me, which is not a zoning matter at all, and I have asked Jay for his off-the-cuff opinion on it, which he then handed off to Sharon, the consulting lawyer, because he wasn't going to be here, which is, can we just keep this away from zoning at all? And presumably we're spending implementation money anyway, to offer cash options for the development rights from the city or some other entity to, say, a 3-year option, which would sort of allow the city to then move forward, and by the city I'm speaking pretty broadly, to move forward with 6 different strategies for developing affordable units in those areas, including selling off that option to someone who is going to do that. That makes sense?
I'm a little confused.
So in
Give
other
me a
words, you
example.
would go to, all right, so you identify 9 houses with big flat lots that are, and you send out a letter to everyone and contact the 9 property owners and say, hey, we want to develop your property sometime in the next 3 years with some assistance. You'll get half the upside. If you're interested in considering something like this, we will pay you for the option to keep that open.
But what does that do to protect the culture and sensitivity of the neighborhood?
They're not going to develop that lot without the owner of the option, which would be the
But
city,
then the owner's going to
CRHA.
end up leaving. The owner's going to end up leaving.
No, we can structure those so that they stay on the plot.
And most of them, think Fikeville, for example, most of those houses are rental units. So
Well, yeah, it would be to the,
What do we do?
again, to the owner to
What do we do to
say,
protect
we're
the-
interested in developing this lot, and we're going to split the upside with you in some fashion. We're paying you cash not to develop it otherwise for the next 2 or 3 years. When the option expires, maybe.
again, see how that protects the culture of that area. And
Yeah, well, it's going to prevent the wholesale development for anyone who agrees to that. It couldn't be enforced, but it could entice. That's unfair, but that's not really a zoning matter. That's sort of a different policy.
Right, it isn't. I'll just offer that, so Jay forwarded the proposal to me. I get the idea. I just offer that it would take us a fair amount of time, even if we could reach agreement that this is something the city wanted to do, it would take us a fair amount of time to put something together to that effect. My feeling is consideration of an idea like that would be something that we'd want to be considering as part of a broader anti-displacement strategy anyway.
Absolutely.
And so if the concern is, I believe, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe the concern is to put something in place or not within the zoning ordinance that serves as a bridge between now and an anti-displacement strategy / small area plan for 10th and Page and that type of work. This won't fill that bridge. won't serve as that bridge.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how quickly you could stand something up. Could you pull this together in 90 days? Theoretically, yes. But do I think that would happen? No, I do not.
Yeah. I love your sense of what local government can do, but I suspect a program of that scale would take us more than 90 days to put together.
Yeah,
Yeah, worries in trying to get in the game.
So, if we're worried that, we complete this rezoning and all of a sudden open the floodgates and somehow there's radical change in these areas, I wonder if it would be best to just return to the Arlington-style permit cap concept to limit the amount of change that could happen in that time. Is it legally defensible? Maybe. We will find out, and by the time the litigation has wrapped up, we will have completed our anti-displacement policy and found a new policy. My general view on this is that it doesn't much matter either way. The status quo is of rapid change in these neighborhoods as a result of single-family home flips. And it seems to me that nothing about the overlay we're discussing is going to limit those in any way. At worst, it could even, exacerbate the problem, where we may have at least had some of those flips add smaller and more attainable units, and instead they will become, even pricier, higher-end flips. So, my view of the most likely scenario here is that even if we don't pass any overlay, the most profitable outcome on most of these small parcels is going to be that flip. And if we do pass the overlay, it's really probably the same, and you may have lost a few better policies. So, it seems to me that zoning policies in general are not going to be very effective on this front. I think everyone seems to agree on that. And so if the worry is just that we don't know for sure, let's put in something like a cap, see what happens, and then reassess.
So you would, just to clarify, it would be a citywide cap, so as to not, I mean.
I guess those are
Well,
falling.
because the concern.
Arlington's was not countywide.
Yeah, I mean, the concern is that turns into, and I haven't dug deep into Arlington, but the concern is that if you're arbitrarily restricting the development in one area but not in another, even if it's not arbitrary, it's for some sort of noble purpose, that amounts to a takings. And you can get dragged in court for a long time, even if it turns out it's not a takings.
So, first off, I guess, I don't know that I haven't heard any updated legal guidance. The last I heard was when we were doing the comprehensive plan and received explicit guidance from Ms. Robertson that the overlay we were contemplating was perfectly legitimate, even with the stated aims and, reasoning for placing it that we had. Second of all, to me, it getting dragged out in court is probably more of a feature than a bug, right? Unless there's an immediate injunction and it gets overturned right away,
Right.
which probably seems unlikely, at least for some time, then it's serving its purpose for that short amount of time we need it to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we just need to acknowledge that this will redound to the benefit of litigators first. And that's what we'll essentially spend money on legal fees to keep it open, which, fine. I'm not objecting to that on principle.
You had some thoughts.
Yes. Reading from the email I sent 2 hours ago. Please forgive any grammar or general awkwardness. Anti-displacement effort making the first single-family home on a parcel require a special use permit so that council can consider its effects on displacement. This would also apply to de-duplixification efforts where two or more homes are combined into one. Does not apply to infill with an existing home or homes preserved on site. Can be ministerially approved by staff with affordability component to address displacement concern. Recommend this either be citywide or a secondary process that is legally separate from the rest of the zoning process so that it can be legally challenged and delayed on a separate timeline. If the second, recommend it include second apartment areas beyond current R1. I also added the word demolitions, regulating demolitions in some way. Not poetic, I realize.
No, I wasn't seeking poetry. We're writing zoning.
Oh, somebody snuck a haiku into that thing in the middle somewhere. You know they did.
I'm going to try and restate it and to see if I get the concept. I mean, you're saying where I have a vacant parcel and I'm proposing to build a single-family house, I would need to get a special use permit. Unless, that may be one of the places where you lost me. You said the ministerial review if I was doing what?
An affordability component according to our definition of an affordable unit.
Okay, so if there was an affordability to it, then I would not need a special use permit.
No, you'd still need one, but if those conditions obtained, it would be administratively approved. Got it. Okay.
Special use permits always have to go through a legislative process.
Right.
So.
So an understanding, I guess, that they're a pass-through.
Right.
Yeah.
Lyle, did you send this to everyone?
No, I was told not to.
Oh. Would it be all right if Lyle forwarded that to us?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, we asked everybody to provide their comments into us. Jose, you have it.
Yeah.
We got feedback from Ms. Pandak, who also we have hopefully promoted as a panelist at this point in time in the meeting, noting that you cannot use an SUP in order to get by right development per Virginia Code Section 15.2-2888.1.
Okay, so other than it's directly illegal, it's a great idea. Okay.
James, just to ask a quick question, that's kind of the basis of this. What's your timeline of a small area plan for 10th and Page and the following neighborhoods, roughly?
I have a lot of work to do to get to the point of knowing exactly what that timeline is going to look like. I actually honestly would allow at least a year for the development of that plan, because I think there's a lot of conversations that need to happen within the community. First, in identifying what are the most salient issues to be addressed, and then in working through those issues. And I'm not going to initiate that work until, at the minimum, this work is complete.
So we could say like 2 years or so.
Yeah, as an outside, we could put it as 2 years. Yeah.
Not holding anyone to it. So we're really looking at what are we going to do for these 2 years.
Yep.
And I mean, for me looking at the study, the rate of change in the C and D areas, which is kind of covers the areas we're talking about, is 3.3% annually at the maximum potential limit. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
The 7.9 and the 7 are for RB and RC,
Okay. Yep.
which there are none in these areas that we're talking about. It's all RA.
Keep in mind that 3.3 makes the assumption that the number that baked into that cake is the idea that the fair market value of the land as its potential is baked into the financial cake. And that's very helpful for making this comprehensible, but of course we know that the quote fair market value of the lot is not what's going to be driving a lot of these purchases for whatever reason. And no builder is interested in paying the fair market value for a lot if they can possibly get away with paying less. So.
Did you just say that people sell their property for less than it's worth?
Sure. I mean, particularly if it's a very fuzzy concept of it's going to arbitrarily be worth, not arbitrarily, but that we are saying that because it has the potential to put two additional units on it, that the value of the land rockets up that way. It may not necessarily, or the first change, or if it does, that first change of title, whoever buys it is probably not going to be at that premium price. That's what I'm saying.
I would argue that people selling their house for less than it's worth is at the very core of this problem, right? You have people who are
Right,
selling
exactly.
it for $200,000 and these houses are getting $10,000 worth of work and put in them and they're selling for $550. That's not a problem that can be solved with zoning. It's something I think we should be working with CAR to help fix with better sellers representation. And I think it should be at the absolute top of the remedies we're pursuing. Because, the absolute most important thing is that the folks who've owned their homes there for decades actually get the value that they're worth. Whether under RA or under R1, these homes are more valuable than they're selling for.
Is there an effective way to deploy that? I mean, for lack of a better term, do you spam out to every property owner in those areas and say, do not even think about selling your house without, consulting somebody, and then, have CAR pick up the ball and maybe they do it? Say, don't even think about selling your place without talking to a realtor? I don't know. Something like that?
As far as actually getting to a solution, the place I would start would actually reach out to the neighborhood association and have a meeting with that group and say, how would you guys give us your opinion on this issue and how would you approach?
Yeah.
Address
Well,
it.
I'm sure we're going to get much better answers once we have more of the one resource we don't, which is time.
So, I think the other complication with any zoning solution here is that, we're kind of talking about what we have called sensitive areas as a monolith in the future land use map, sensitive areas anyway. We've heard different things from different neighborhoods, right? 10th and Page is the one that's really driving this conversation right now, I think. Fifeville has been a little bit more ambivalent to an extent. We've heard from the Meadows, several people in the Meadows, that they absolutely do not want any restriction on maximizing the value of their property. So, would we apply any sort of overlay uniformly to all of the ones identified in the future land use map? Or would we, make it more targeted?
Or do we apply it to everywhere and start pulling it off in order of need?
I think what I worry is that we apply something, we do a focused, deep engagement in the 10th and Page neighborhood. We remove it in favor of our new policy for the 10th and Page neighborhood, the people who wanted it the most, and then we end up leaving it everywhere else who didn't want it in the first place.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, me too. Nobody said this is easy.
So it looks like, Mr. Schwartz.
I was just gonna say, I think on the map, having the overlay there as a reminder is still important for when we're doing rezonings nearby those areas or in those areas. So I think there's a purpose for it. Like, we shouldn't just delete it, but I'm not sure that.
Well, it should remain as a part of the comprehensive plan, and certainly therefore should be part of your deliberations as
Okay.
part of any discretionary permit or rezoning or what have you, as part of the comprehensive plan.
So what you're suggesting is that it remain on the map. It may remain a guiding light for us.
Yeah, and
but we don't codify it. It doesn't get codified in the ordinance.
Yes, so I guess just confirming that it doesn't get deleted off the comprehensive plan map or doesn't,
Well,
disappear.
what I like that. I like keeping it on the map, so it's a guiding light. I like not codifying it in an ordinance. And then I like the idea of each neighborhood is different, and you've got different needs. The Meadows has different needs. Fifeville has different needs. 10th and Page, they have different needs. And I like the idea of, again, keeping it on the map, using it as a guiding light, keeping it in mind as we make decisions as we go through the neighborhoods, writing small area plans that are unique and special to the needs of those neighborhoods. Anybody else have any thoughts you want to challenge that? Or?
Well, the challenge to that is that doesn't really apply. That doesn't put an interim tool in anybody's hands. We're just saying we're walking away from sort of an interim tool. We're relying on the small area plans, and we're optimistic. I firmly believe we can get one of them done soup to nuts in 2 years. Do I think we can be on parallel tracks with more than one and get them done in that time frame? No, I don't.
Well, what hardens me is the rate of change that Mr. Bob just kind of walked us through. 3 houses in
70.
In all of the neighborhoods combined. Not the C and D,
no,
this the anti-displacement
Yeah,
neighborhood.
there's 70 a year.
Maximum, is according to this, but
Yeah.
you're saying it could be more.
Well, one, so the weaknesses with that are, number one, it doesn't know anything about the lot except its designated size, except its designation and its assessed value, and, if it's a recent sale or not. Doesn't know if it's flat or hilly, doesn't know about the conditions of the street, doesn't know anything about that. So that's a huge wrench. And that will also drive how much development can happen on it. So to contrast between 10th and Page and the Meadows has these lovely 1/3 and 1/4 acre lots, and they're flat by the standards of Charlottesville, not Kansas. And 10th and Page, you're not going to find a lot like that to be had. So that's going to skew things more towards those areas. And then, of course, I think it's difficult. What's baked into the cake is we're assuming that someone's going to have to pay the full after improved market value for that lot in order to develop it. And that, because people are not rational, that ain't going to happen. And developers aren't going to play that game. They try to buy low, sell high.
Do you have an interim tool that you'd like to recommend that's legal?
Are there any further questions? If not, can we move to adjourn? No, I don't have any. I've got three that we've got two and a half from the hack, one of which is not a zoning solution at all and probably has a ramp up that's too big. The other one does in fact have an overlay on it, and then the third one Jay thinks is dubious. So, although he hasn't reached, as far as I know, he hasn't concluded and killed it. He just said that he felt like it was on life support.
Which one is that?
That's the seasoning issue.
That's the first one.
Stay 2 years. You got to be on the title for 2 years before you can
Got it.
develop, sort of thing. He thinks that's a takings issue.
And, well, anyways, that wouldn't change or stop what's happening today, right? Like, people can still buy and like flip a house and sell it in the neighborhood and keep it as a single family.
Yeah, if you can keep it as a single family. But I think, Rory's right. That's happening. That's, what we do is not going to move that needle. Maybe something like the overlay with the sunset on it.
And I just want to add, before we get too focused on the small area plan part of this, just noting also that we want to amend the affordable housing plan with a more robust anti-displacement strategy. It looks at what we're already doing, what capacity we have to increase or improve what we're doing, and what are there other tools that are out there. Because as Rory said, as I think we've all said, zoning is not only is it not the only tool, it's not even the best tool in the toolkit. And it's interesting, every conversation I have with folks about this anti-displacement issue keeps coming back to, well, are you looking at tax relief? Well, are you looking at rent relief? Well, are you looking at education, around property values? Like, that's because those are the tools that we really need to be putting in place. And that shouldn't take as long as a small area plan. That should be something that we can put together much more quickly and put together a set of recommendations.
I received feedback
90
from
days.
Ms. Panda that she said that, that she agreed with Jay that the first alternative provided was not legally sustainable.
Okay, yeah, all right. So now we're 2-0 on that.
So, in the near term, I wonder if there are some quick and easy non-zoning tools we can do concurrently with implementing the zoning. Things like sending out a mailing to everyone in those neighborhoods that says, hey, here's the chat program, here's the real estate tax relief for the elderly and disabled program. These are your options. Also, this is what your property is assessed at. You probably don't want to sell it for anything less than that.
I'll note, Fifeville Neighborhood Association did a really good job of starting a conversation around these types of tools and bringing a lot of people around the table to talk about it. So there's some work to build on in this space, that we're not necessarily breaking new ground.
I mean, and you can tell me if this needs to come later, but I also think we do need to look at the adjacencies to these neighborhoods. And
So
if that's a later
in my mind,
map
I rolled
discussion.
this into the same conversation, so I think it's totally appropriate
Okay.
to raise it. Yeah.
I mean, you know, we've got, for Preston Avenue, it's zoned as CX5, and there's a little chunk of CX8. And I'm not gonna lie, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we need to have as much density on Preston as we can get, but it needs to be sensitive to the neighborhoods. And I don't know if we can set up a way that, well, a CX5 project would be Dairy Market all the way down Preston. I mean, and it would be by right. There'd be no chance for the neighborhood to come in and say, well, we'd really like you to put in some services that we can actually afford to use, or, you know, anything like that. It would just be, I mean, it could be whatever the developer wants it to be, and chances are it's going to be expensive. So I don't know if we need to look at, maybe Preston needs to be CX3 with some sort of thing written into the code that says, we invite you to try to provide greater density, greater height, but you just need to go through a process with us to, you know, make sure you're actually making something sensitive to the neighborhood.
So that's not exactly what CX5 is, right? CX5 is more like 10th and Dairy all the way down Preston, and CX3 is more like Dairy Market
Yes,
all the way
10th and
down.
Dairy. I'm
Because that's
lumping the
the
whole project
problem, I
together
think,
in my
with
head.
this idea that you can just downzone and make something sensitive, is that just gets you Dairy Market, which was perfectly by right, you know, an applauded historic preservation, keeping the feel of the neighborhood, you know, a single tall story, and what, a 3-story office building on the back. And, you know, you could mimic that all the way down perfectly legally under any zoning you could feasibly put there. And all that's gonna do is create more amenities that drive even more, you know, influx pressure on each of the neighborhoods surrounding it without doing anything to meet that influx with new housing.
Well, so how do we get some control over what happens on these adjacent corridors?
Private property, I don't know if we can, I mean, unless we make it like RA, and then they have to rezone it or something.
I mean, you can ban housing there if you want, but I think it's just going to make outcomes worse. I think
I don't
the
wanna
better
ban
outcome is
housing.
we
I mean,
get required affordable.
What I want to
units
do
out
is
of it.
do something that entices the developer to actually go through an SUP process. That's where I'm coming from.
So, I mean, I think maybe you could have proactive economic development, you know, programs that seek to engage developers and create the sorts of uses we want to see. I think, you know, maybe there's some development manual tweaks we can make so that things adjacent to, I mean, I guess things on the scale we're talking about require TDM plans. They need to have meetings anyway. But, you know, I would argue that maybe anything near a sensitive neighborhood should have at least a community meeting. Even if it's not forcing binding changes, at least you're opening up an avenue of discussion. But I mean, that's a tough nut to crack, right? Like you could put a fancy food hall anywhere you want in a commercial zone, and unless you're gonna make it RA, I don't see how you get around that.
So, I mean, so if we kind of break things out a little bit, the question of how to create leverage is we know the answer to that. You apply a special use permit. So you downzone the property and you require a special use permit to exceed the height. So that's your mechanism. Whether that gets you a different outcome at the end of the day in terms of what businesses are able to locate there in the future is kind of a different question. So the Cherry Ave project is a great example of that. There's a strong desire for a grocery store. There's not a commitment from that developer to produce a grocery store. There is a commitment to give it a good, solid try. And I don't anticipate the ability to do better than that in any other negotiation. I mean, I think what it is going to come back to each and every time is land ownership, right? I mean, I said in the existing scenario of Preston Avenue, quite honestly, the services that have served those adjacent neighborhoods, the businesses and so on, are, dare I say, largely already gone, right? We've already seen the brew pubs and the restaurants move into that corridor in the existing condition without changing a single building. So where other communities are having success in establishing or retaining those neighborhood serving businesses is in creating new opportunities for people to own land or for the community to own the land and/or the business and establish that in that place. And so, again, but we find ourselves similarly to where we've been in the anti-displacement conversation, the affordable housing conversation, is that zoning is not the strongest tool in the toolbox. Because zoning is just regulating land use, and we're trying to proactively promote land use solutions that support that community over time. That's about ownership and subsidy, and that's what those are the strategies kind of in that bucket. Do you use a special use permit to try and leverage, to try and get some of those resources into the project? That's an option, right? You can use a special use permit to as leverage to try and get some resources that would support those ownership and subsidy objectives. But you always have the flip side that someone can choose not to pursue a special use permit and move forward with what's there. So, but that's, all I can do is kind of set up the scenarios for you. You guys get to knock them down.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for the special use permit route to be effective, you need to be credible that you would actually, award the special use permit under the conditions that you're asking for, ideally, in advance so that expectations are set. And I don't know that that is necessarily a credible thing we can say right now. I will say, Preston has a unique maybe opportunity for city-owned land because we can essentially create an acre of land by fixing the 10th Grady Preston intersection and use it for something useful rather than a big grassy lot in the middle of a street, which we've talked about, or which was vaguely the plan before.
Yeah, I believe we floated a plan, there was a plan floated to fix that acre in 2004?
There's been lots of plans floated.
Yeah,
I mean, they had
the mayor at the time was flogging it, and he ended up face planting on it, but they wanted to move that. And it was 1.6 acres or something that could have been generated. But that just means moving roads around and.
Are you talking about the triangle?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, there are an awful lot of utilities under there. So it's more than, there's a lot underground going on. So, it adds to the discussion.
Yeah, the city can probably obtain an acre and a half of buildable land for cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, that's the sort of thing, this sort of conversation I think you'd have in a small area plan process. But I think, in terms of whether zoning is an effective tool to kind of use an SUP or a downzoning with hinting at a potential allowing an upzoning or an SUP in the future, to hope that we get what we want by bringing them to the table, I wonder if that's going to be effective. And I feel like you're probably going to be a lot more effective doing it with more of a carrot than a stick, and using the economic development department rather than NES.
I hope we can figure out a way to do that, because once we pass this plan, I think, we're gonna, the Stony Point development is gonna, they can do exactly what they wanted to do in the first place.
They can only do it if they give us 50 deeply affordable units, though.
That is, yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that. That is true.
Another possible option is to take the lot, in this case in the middle, and downzone that. So they'd have to change it.
Checkerboard the whole thing. That's kind of devious. I like it. I don't think it's going to work.
So,
but
yeah,
okay.
but, I mean, how practical is this notion? I mean, I like, Rory, your notion of, look, it's a lot easier to get an SUP if everyone's much more amenable to an SUP if there are 3 affordable units in that building, or whatever, or 10 or whatever. Your essential argument is that you hold that as the key to the kingdom, that if you want to do what you want to do, in this SUP process, the setbacks have to be so-and-so, you've got to have affordable, blah, blah, blah. Is that your...
Well, no. I mean, I think that's what we should be doing in our...
All of them, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the rules we're making. That's the zoning ordinance we're talking about. We would require, and if they're trying to do 400, 500 units, and they're trying to do 7 stories in CX5, those need to be 50 units affordable at 50% AMI, which
yeah.
is, really significant, actually. It's something we would spend many millions of dollars trying to do and many years through LIHTC.
Yeah, well.
Potentially in the 8 figures.
Oh, no, all day long.
So,
8 figures all day long, yeah.
if the problem is then we won't have a laundromat, I think we save a lot of more money by saying, well, we'll rent out a space and put in a laundromat, or we'll give you X tax increment to have a laundromat there, than to try to contort a special use permit process to make that work.
So, Mr. Chair, could you, perhaps, could we see where everyone's sort of sitting on this? Because I'm not really sure where we're all.
Well, let me feed back what I've got, and then you guys can walk me through what I'm missing. There are a couple, maybe 3 areas of agreement. One, zoning ain't gonna get the job done, so that's not the way to go about this. The other piece is, even though zoning won't get the job done, we cannot forget where these sensitive neighborhoods are. So we don't do away with the overlays that are on the map, just to remind us and just keep that there as a guiding light. We also think that each neighborhood is unique. Each of the sensitive neighborhoods are unique, and that each of them ought to have their own unique approach to being protected, and that's through small area plans. But so we all agree on that. Where we have not landed the plane is on what happens in the interim between now and the small area plans, and what happens in the adjacent properties. What happens with those? We haven't figured out exactly how to handle those. Did I miss anything, Wow? So the 2 things are interim and the adjacent properties.
And where are we on Rory's notion of Picasso's notion of the great, the mediocre borrow the great steal, and just stealing Arlington's idea of capping building permits? And do we do that
We would have to do that
citywide?
citywide, though, wouldn't we? And would that help?
So would that help us? Would we easily get ourselves in a situation where someone could say, you're not approving these things on their own individual merits, or or things are getting prioritized in the wrong direction? It's just sort of rife if you're not treating it absolutely fairly.
We've got our lawyer online, so he can help us.
To that precise question, I have already opined to Mr. Frias that I do not believe you can legally set caps on building permits, sir.
All right. Never mind.
I have 2 unresolved thoughts that I'd like to return to. Demolition permits and deduplexification regulation. Mr. Freeze, can you address those ideas?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the second one. The notion there is to actually have essentially a no net loss policy when it comes to residential units, right? So you could have a requirement that you can't turn a duplex into a single family or otherwise reduce the number of units on a given lot. The first one, on terms of regulating demolitions, I actually am not sure what we can do in that space. I don't know.
Is your thinking that this would be only in these sensitive areas, or is this citywide?
I would recommend citywide for legal reasons.
So if we're going to do a no net loss policy, do we want that to be consistent? For example, if anything that has a commercial input, I'm of the opinion that anything in the RA zone that you build has got to have a residential unit in it, period. So any of these sort of small commercial operations that have caused all this storm and drang amongst people, you know, if you're going to build a convenience store, it better have an apartment in the back of it, sort of thing. Does that sort of lend into a no net loss policy? I mean, could we make that broad? Just like, if you're going to build an RA, you got to have a residential unit in it. If you're going to, you know, if you've got 2 units, you need to end with 2 or 3, sort of thing.
For the commercial, we have SUPs.
Yeah, those
on
are only
it
by
now.
SUP anyway, so you could just simply not approve them otherwise.
Well, I'm not against approving them. I think that if we just mandate that if you're going to build commercial space in RA or RB, you got to have a residential unit on the property.
I don't think we need to do that because they're an SUP. Like, if we have a good reason to, if something comes up that doesn't have one, you know, out
The
of.
reason I think it's necessary is that if we've zoned a lot RA, that's to put as many as 4 families on it, and we're just sort of saying there's potentially 4 units that are never going to be built on that property. And as a general principle and philosophical point, if it's residential property, we need to have a resident on it.
I mean, I guess a counterpoint might be either Ivana River Company, where you're in the floodplain, you don't want to put houses there, but you probably want the kayak rentals.
Well, that's a grandfathered.
Sure, but
Yeah,
I mean, if
I
they
don't
were
want to
going
argue with your
today, right?
example. Yeah, I don't want to argue with your example. Yeah, I mean, I just sort of spit that out. I'm not saying it's a completely nuanced policy, but
Yeah,
it's just a basic
I mean, I
conversation.
think as a general rule, that's a pretty reasonable thing to apply to the special use permits. But I mean, I think it's a little bit tangential to what Commissioner Salt Yates is suggesting. With, I mean, you're really thinking of duplex deconversions where we're just removing.
Yeah, I was just
units, right?
expanding it to say about, you know, if we're going to deal with no net loss, what does that really mean, and how do we apply it across a broader area? As an example.
Did you get what you were looking for?
I think so. If we could have a clearer idea on demolition, I think that may be useful.
Yeah, help me, what are you thinking about in terms of demolition?
So big picture, I've actually got a map from Mr. Werner today of all the areas where we currently do have demolition regulation, and it's a lot. It's really a lot, but it's not the sensitive areas.
Well, it's those areas that are covered by some form of historic district.
Precisely.
And I'm not sure, what I'm not sure of is whether we have the authority outside of a historic district to limit demolition, or, you know, historic or similar type district.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you would just say it's a historic district, right? I mean, we are concerned about them because of their historic nature.
Certainly, well, right, like that's one of the things that's in the toolkit, right, is considering a historic district in those areas. I think, again, that's the type of thing I would want to consider in concert
Small area
with
plan.
those communities. I wouldn't necessarily want to, right now, go forward with something like that. Just on the no net loss, I'm a little concerned about putting that citywide, just because I think there's a number of scenarios where you might want to permit the flexibility in there, and maybe there's details on how that's written. You've said a couple times, Commissioner, about going citywide for, I forget what did you say? For
Legal reasons.
legal reasons. You want to elaborate on that?
I am concerned that the more kinds of legal exposure we bake into this zoning plan, the more ways it can be delayed and overturned.
Sure. Okay.
Is there a way to get demolitions without having the historic overlay? Like a limit, do we know?
I'm not aware of any within what is enabled under our zoning legislation at the state level.
That's, I mean,
Yeah.
I know that, no, we mentioned, or the legal mentioned that permits we can't, but that, I mean, this works even better than having a permit cap, because the demolitions will target the lowest value homes, which are the ones that we're trying to protect.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Yes, yes.
Whenever you start looking at putting caps on things in the zoning context, unless there's clear authority that has been upheld, sometimes there's clear authority and then it's struck down. I would have to caution you that trying to put any caps on number of permits, number of demolitions, is going to not be considered legally authorized, and also runs into the issue of, and I'll explain it this way, if there's a limit and there's a cap, then there's going to be a race to see who can pick up permits. And then people are going to be left out, either because they don't know about it, didn't need one right at the time, and those are the people that are likely to sue you and succeed.
So, back to sort of we sort of, when we go over this, we keep coming back to, each individual community and group needs to figure out, and we need to, and the city needs to sort of bring that forward and examine that. Acknowledging that that's true, I go back to the idea of a sunset provision of some sort that gives, yes, it does make every problem look like a nail, so it's a hammer, but it's a 2-year deal to sort of slow the process, put a halt until we can start putting some of those other things in place. And I'm not sure what that looks like in terms of what is done and what the limit is.
And this would be only in the anti-displacement zone.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point here, that we're trying to, we're trying to keep an avalanche from sweeping through those neighborhoods. And even if it's not the prettiest thing in the world, and a little
So
ham.
we'll wrap a couple of words around that. Maybe we can get the our legal
I'm
person
not
to-
sure what exactly that looks like. Maybe that is
like
some.
no demolition, no construction in.
Well, yeah, but when the
could be
problem
first
is you
unit
got to get away
affordable.
from the takings issue. Like, I can't do what I want with my property. So I'm not sure what that answer is. Something like that overlay that was earlier contemplated about having to have an affordable unit, that Lisa Robertson said, hey, I think this will work, and just say it's a 2-year sunset,
Yeah.
just to give us just a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah, sure.
I'll say I'm not 100% sure it's the right thing to do, but if we want to do something like that, that's what I would also suggest, is having a 2-year sunset rule, and the first unit has to be affordable if you do any kind of redevelopment in those areas. Oh, we have,
Please.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, and I hate to be so negative, or a string of negatives, but there is no authority to do sunsets. When you adopt a zoning ordinance, it is the ordinance. It's not a temporary ordinance. It is the ordinance until you amend that ordinance under state law. And there's a case that clearly says you can't do inter ordinances. And attempts in the past to get authority from the General Assembly to do sunsets, to my knowledge, have not been successful.
Right, so is there a legal way to do something to protect the sensitive areas in the interim?
I have to say, as I told Mr. D'Orzio, this issue has come to me relatively recently. I need to talk to Mr. Frias about it, Mr. Stroman further, but I think the appropriate way to do it is the way that Mr. Frias has already described, which is outside of the zoning ordinance, provide various incentives or disincentives through other processes. Now, arguably, you may need some money to do that. There are some things you can do in terms of education that may be helpful, but the law does not favor putting caps which allows certain people through the door to do what they want and then blocks others.
So you sure it's going to take us more than 90 days to stand up an option regime?
Okay.
All right.
So,
So we can't sunset.
Ms. Pendek, are you saying that, even the kind of original concept, where there's no cap in terms of a permit limit or anything, but just that there are different rules that apply to particular areas of the city, such that an affordability requirement is applied for the second unit. Are those also impermissible?
I don't know that I can answer your question. You're in my mind, because maybe I'm not understanding it. There are two aspects of your question. One is, can you select areas in the city that you want to give special attention to or protection to? The answer is that might be possible, assuming that you can articulate specific public purpose reasons that distinguish them and that the requirements are uniform within them. So that's possible. That's not the question I've been asked. What I've understood was that there was an intent to make across the city changes. And then separately, the question is, do you have to do it in the zoning ordinance? And the answer to that is that you can provide incentives, financial grants, or not provide incentives to certain areas with not providing grants, assuming that whoever's making the grants has some flexibility, and I can't speak to that. But there are other ways of doing it.
So we could potentially offer more tax relief in these areas, that sort of thing? Tax relief grants?
I haven't looked at the tax relief, but the answer is that we'd have to go back and look at the separate authority. And when you say more, I haven't looked at what authority, what you're using right now. So I can't give you a final answer.
All right, thanks. That's a fun story behind that too, actually.
So it looks, once again, looks like we're back where we were at the beginning. Again, with those three things that we talked about that we agree on. And that, as opposed to doing something in the interim through a code ordinance, we have to stick to education incentives and disincentives.
Sorry, let me make sure I'm hearing the three things are where we are right now. So,
Again, the things I think we all agree on, zoning ain't the issue, ain't the answer. The other thing is we do want to keep the overlays on the map just as a guiding light to keep us focused on protecting those neighborhoods. And the other is we want to immediately, as soon as we get through this, begin focusing on the fight fills and 10th and Pages and all the other sensitive areas so that each unique neighborhood gets its own small area plan. And in the interim, there's not much that we can do in the code to protect these sensitive areas. And the best way to protect them is through developing some sort of incentives or disincentives, as well as education to the owners as relates to what their properties are worth. That's where I'm hearing from my colleagues and the lawyer. The only thing we haven't answered is Carl's question about the adjacent properties.
I think Rory is smarter than I am on this issue, and I'm going to defer to his opinion on that, which is not to. It doesn't sound like the SUP thing's going to work the way I was hoping it would.
I mean, I guess to steelman your argument for a minute, like, while it's true that you could put a food hall on every single block and put a dairy market everywhere, maybe, obviously there's money to be made in building housing, even with the significant affordability requirements, and maybe that's enough of an incentive to get people to come to the table, to get this particular person to come to the table, to come and beg us for more. The risk, of course, is that you get the by right development, which is how you end up with, a 9-story, half-empty office tower on Garrett Street instead of a bunch of apartments, studios renting for $1,000 a month. It's a risk we could take, and it's, a risk we could take temporarily under the idea that we would potentially change it in 2 years, which might make it more of a risk because he currently has an option to buy the site and, could act on it in the meantime under that by right scenario. So You know, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's not any value to try to get someone to come to the table. I just think there's a lot of downside risk, and it's not a particularly effective tool.
I mean, well, you said the risk was the 9-story office building. The risk instead is we get 3 stories of commercial lining there and no housing.
Yeah.
So
The 9-story was a different district.
Yeah.
Different risk. But yeah, I mean, that's the risk, right? The only thing we're withholding is the housing, which is the thing that helps us and gets us affordable housing.
I've had Kathy Galvin on the mind recently, so I'd like to say a Kathy Galvin term, synthetic TIF, tax increment financing.
Also a hack recommendation. I mean, I'm not sure how, I mean, it gets us money. I'm not sure what we do with it.
Well, you could open a laundromat.
And I mean, I just, not directly as zoning. A useful tool, right? Something that to be considered. I heard ideas at as you noted, at the hack meeting, interesting ideas in the TIF world. I think there's a lot of opportunity in TIFs, but purely from a zoning perspective, I mean, from the SUP idea is, it fundamentally is a question of, do we use that tool to create leverage, to garner resources that we can apply towards the needs that are being identified, right? And it's recognizing the upsides and downsides of that. The downside is that a risk that the SUP process itself becomes a deterrent to that type of development. I would, Roy, rather than attaching it to the use, I would propose that we do effectively a special exception type process and attach it to the height. But there's pros and cons with that.
Well, if
So,
it's not,
sorry, go ahead.
if it's not zoning, it's something else. So the concern here is that it seems to me that we've got an economic development piece, we've got a housing affordability piece, we've got some other piece that if those things do not, if we say this isn't in zoning, we need to handle it outside of zoning, that, zoning is our wheelhouse here, but we need to, I mean, somehow, well, the rest of this has got to get stood up and moving fast. And not, and we really have to mean it, that we're going to stand it up and move it fast, and that most of this will get done in 2024. So at the end, in terms of programs to stand up, and I mean, we're not going to get small area plans on that fast, but whatever programs we put in place, we got to design and build them, stand them up, and get them out the door. That's not really our wheelhouse, but I don't want to feel like we're passing the buck to people who, what wheelhouse is, who we passing the buck to, and do they know it's just been passed to them? I don't have a solution to that.
I guess I'd also say, if you were to do that, ratchet it down and offer the carrot offer the possibility of an SUP for more, I think you would have to do it more than even more than CX3, right? Even that is probably too much, where it becomes somewhat attractive to just do CX3. And you would have to, probably effectively mandate the built form that's there in order to make any redevelopment unattractive indefinitely for those parcels. A whole lot of parking, single story, old, small footprint, auto-oriented buildings, to make it untenable to proceed by right. And I don't see how you do that without making a new district.
I mean, I'm not sure the goal is to make it untenable to proceed by right so much as it is to say where a project gets to a certain scale, we're looking to effectively negotiate a community benefit. Because the resulting project has to be big enough to be worthwhile. To be worthwhile to to cover kind of that cost of that process, the unknowns that come with it, and ultimately whatever's sought in that.
The 10th and Market project did, I think I'm getting the stories right. It was 4 stories and it wanted it went through an SUP for a 5th story for the original project, right? And I believe that's what they were talking about with their next phase, I thought.
So the next phase is proposed as 7 stories.
7 story, okay.
I don't know.
I don't remember the details.
Okay.
It did receive a special use.
There you go.
But was it from 4 to 5 or was it from 5 to 6 stories? I know they wanted to increase the density as well, but I thought they got,
I believe to 5 to increase density. but
Okay.
definitely will.
that's what I thought. So there was some incentive to go from what's currently there to get an extra story to go through the whole SUP process. I don't know.
So are you getting close to getting something you need?
There's a maximum building.
I don't want to leave this until
No,
you're happy with.
I appreciate that. What's the sense of the commission on this point? Should we go ahead and draft something?
Let me repeat what I think the consensus is. And the consensus again is zoning ain't the answer. We need to keep the overlay just as a guiding light, so that's there. And we need to begin focusing and let the community know that the answer is going to be in the individual small area plans for the sensitive neighborhoods.
But I was actually referring to the corridor.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, that's all right.
No, I'll lean on that end of the table for that.
Well, actually, I mean, how do you guys, is this a go or no-go for the rest of you guys?
Sorry, what are you proposing to draft? That a project over X thousand
Something
square
along those
feet
lines,
would
yeah.
be required to go through a special use permit process, or
Something along those lines, yeah.
blanket across the city?
I think I would want to tie that to the those areas that we've identified as anti-displacement areas. I think I would still tie it back to that.
So it would have to be a property that abutted one of those parcels or somehow, or across the street, or something like that.
TBD, but
Yeah.
I think in order to kind of state a valid public purpose and treat everybody within the district uniformly, that's
Yeah.
the direction I would go.
I actually like the idea of basing it on square footage. That seems to make more sense to me, just because then it's the big block-sized projects that are really disruptive.
Yes.
Yes, I think
Yeah,
that's.
I mean, it's the
So,
closest.
I mean,
yeah.
that is nearly every corridor in the city, really, except for High Street, 29 and Fish Street, right? So
Yeah.
it's West Main, it's Preston, it's Cherry, it's Avon, or at least Avon north of Elliott.
It's not.
It's a lot of Fish Street, actually. I mean, what kind of square footage cutoff would you be thinking?
And with that, just then, which is not a bad thing, we'll just get granular. People could still find a way around it.
Yeah, right, like this
Yeah,
proposed
well,
Area Central project is really 4 buildings or something, right? But depending on how they do it. Would each of those be counted separately, potentially, or they would have to phase it to make that happen? That could be counted as one development?
I'd have to break up the site plan, which I think
Number
would
of-
be difficult.
Square foot per parcel, period. Some number.
Let us take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So my anticipation is, coming out of this conversation, we'll bring something back with specific language for you guys to consider and hopefully finalize at your next.
I have some more off-topic spaghetti if it's helpful. We have an annual capital improvement plan process. We could put these priorities in the plan and fund them.
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest worry about this, right, is that we go right back to our 2003 scenario where we say we want all of these auto-oriented corridors to be retrofitted into nice mixed-use corridors with housing, and now required affordable housing. And here, we just created this great mixed-use zoning code to do that. But we made everyone run through this gauntlet of a special use permit process with extremely unpredictable outcomes that have only gotten more unpredictable over the last 2 decades. And, you know, for this in particular, I think would be the most unpredictable it's ever been, probably. And so you end up stifling everything and getting nothing.
But West Main certainly wasn't stifled.
Yeah, that's the one we got in the last 20 years. Even
better
took a
or
decade
worse.
for that one. You know, I think a big, even before I got on this commission, right? Way back in 2017, 2018, a big thing the commission was talking about as part of this comprehensive plan process was to make more predictable outcomes and defined rules for what we want to see in the city, so that we're not leaving everything to negotiation up here. And I think we really need to question whether the rules we've defined are what we want to see. And I think in a lot of ways the answer is yes. We, for the first time, have required affordable housing with more deeply affordable housing required for what is being proposed on that particular site we're talking about. And, you know, ultimately, the things that we don't like about that are not really things that we can require at all. It's that we don't like the guy who is doing it because he, you know, is seen as not having fulfilled his promises in the past. And we're not well equipped to, you know, in a zoning code, create rules that apply to particular people for their behavior. But I suppose you can do that with discretionary review, right? You can deny anything you want because you don't like them. You just have to say it's for something else. But do we lose all of those benefits, all of those things we've been working for the last, 7 years to make a better process in order to achieve that? I just don't think it's worth it.
I think putting a process on something that's over a certain size, depending on what that size ends up being, it does give us a goal of trying to get more granular development, which I think is a goal. And I also don't think that I know there are people in the neighborhood who don't like the development because of the developer, but it's also because what the development contains in it, which is stuff that is completely unaffordable to the neighborhood. And I don't know if it actually increases property values in the neighborhood, but it definitely, that is a strong belief that is causing gentrification throughout the neighborhood. So there's more to it than just the, stuff that happened in the past.
Well, are we talking about area market, or are we talking about, what's proposed in this next phase? Because it seems to me the dairy market would continue to be allowed even under this new thing, right? It's not particularly large in square footage and certainly not in height. So, are we making all these rules to try to stop a thing that's not even stopping in the first place?
I guess, the other thing that I think of is, if it comes to property value, I think tax relief it would be the answer, not a zoning issue. And I understand, like, this specific parcel, but if this was a project that was happening anywhere else, generally, that was going to put 50 affordable housing units at 50% AMI, we would all be all for it, that.
We keep saying 50. Were they proposing 500 units?
I'm quoting Rory on
I mean,
that.
we don't have an application, right? But that's what the news has said.
And
Okay.
400 to 500 was the
even
quote.
with an SUP process, I don't think we can condition I can never shop in some of the stores in there, but I don't think that's something we could put conditions on anyways.
No.
But we could spend money on it if we wanted.
And it gives the neighborhood a chance to
Voice
their concerns.
Which actually brings me to another point on the development review. That probably should be a mandatory community meeting for projects of a certain size. It was, I think, one of the tree commission's recommendations. Could you speak to that?
So effectively, there is,
Okay.
in that we've included the projects that trigger the transportation demand management, which is right now set at 50,000 square feet, are required to conduct a community meeting. And that now the intent there, not stated in the document, but the intent there is to recognize, since the purpose of the transportation demand management plan is to address both the transportation system impacts, but also any particularized impacts on the neighborhood from both a transportation and a parking perspective. It behooves the developer to have a conversation with that community on those issues. So we're setting that up. You could state that just flat out, not untied to the TDM, but just flat out, there's a new requirement for a community meeting.
We could make it lower too. I mean, 50,000 is roughly, I don't know, 30 to 50-ish units. We can change that to be any number we want that we think is fit. 50 seems like, it's a big project. I'd even move for that to be like a 20 unit or a 10 unit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with requiring more community meetings. It seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do.
Right, Mr. Freeze, what do you need from us?
So
I don't think we gave an answer.
right now, I'm taking away that we're going to draft some language relative to some form of discretionary permit related to corridors adjacent to anti-displacement zones. So an anti-displacement overlay, if you will, that's focused on corridor areas. And we will discuss that, put something together, and have that at the next work session, assuming that you guys make the decision to not vote on the ordinance this evening.
Okay.
So just for some quick context here, Dairy Market is 39,000 square feet, if I'm reading GIS right. The office is 62,500 square feet. And then the apartment building is approximately 200,000 square feet, at least as of the SUP.
Are you
Okay.
ready to chat
Sure.
about the exemption process?
Yes. All right, so the other topic we wanted to touch on tonight is this conversation around special exceptions or some form of varying the form requirements. So when I say form requirements, I'm referring to basically everything that represents a standard or a requirement around the physical development of a building. So setbacks, height, building width, what have you, could be the active depth, could be transparency requirements, all of those things. At a previous meeting, it was suggested that there should be a form of special exception process related to that. I wanted to note that the draft ordinance does right now offer two methods, just so we know what's in there today. One of those is that an up to 15% administrative modification. So that means during the site plan review process, under review, we could do up to a modification of up to 15% of any standard, not including density requirements, story height, some of the basic kind of fundamental things that define the zoning districts don't vary, but other standards could at 15%. And then there is the variances themselves, which have a hardship standard. And I'd note that topography is frequently considered a hardship standard, and one that certainly would come up in Charlottesville. What's been talked about is a special exception process, which would, as we've conceptualized it, would mirror the special use permit process. So that would be a public hearing, recommendation from Planning Commission, and decision by City Council. And we would we would suggest that in addition to kind of the standard criteria we use, that we also look to criteria related to the degree to which the project proposes to otherwise mitigate the issues of the standard that they're seeking to vary. So identifying those issues, what are those things that the standard is in place to address, and there's some form of mitigation offered relative to those areas. Something that we internally are still discussing, in fact, it would be essential for us to discuss this with our legal counsel, Ms. Pandek, is we've heard from a number of people that the county offers a special exception process that actually does not go to the planning commission, incorporates a staff review that then goes straight to council and frequently is simply placed on a consent agenda. I'm sorry, not council. In the county's case, it's Board of Supervisors, but you get my drift. Is frequently placed on the Board of Supervisors consent agenda and carries forward that way. That's been offered. Our initial review of that was that we didn't see that as something that was possible, but it's been noted again as something that, the county does it. So we'll be discussing that, but I guess my question for the Planning Commission in particular is, A, if there is an interest in, I guess we should start with the threshold question, is there an interest in this form of special exception process? And we can discuss that. But the second part of that is, B, if we were interested in that form of process, would you guys be in favor of that kind of a process that is more streamlined, if it were possible, legally enabled to do?
Yes.
Hey, okay.
If I put my architecture firm hat on, I'd say, yes, that sounds great. But as a planning commissioner, I think I'm more hesitant because I don't want to open that as an option that everybody can just do without having to really look at the zoning ordinance that we're going to put out.
I'm sorry, which question are you answering? I'm sorry.
Having the special exemption process.
Having it at all? Okay.
That goes to a planning commission. If it's, if we can tweak that 15% administrative modification, that's a way to streamline it too. It could be higher and kind of go through the same channel. If we're having the community benefits meetings, I mean, that's kind of the big benefit of those is you're almost like, like it is going to be an SCP process. And when it's a big project and you need to change some stuff, what's the community benefit? If that's a thing that we're already going to implement adjacent to the sensitive areas or abutting with sensitive areas, I think that takes care of, why we would want to have this. Does that make sense?
So let me see if I can sum up, you can tell me if I got it. You're suggesting that if we move forward with the anti-displacement overlay on the corridors adjacent to sensitive community areas, that kind of replaces the need for a special exception process from your perspective?
A lot of the need for that.
I've got to, so, couldn't let it go with just one word, could I? I hesitate on sort of expanding that too much, because every time that you expand, say, the percentage, you're opening up an opportunity for someone to say that they weren't being treated fairly compared to somebody else, right? I mean, this is supposed to be for relatively utilitarian purposes. You're getting the special exception because it makes no sense to do this without the special exception, which is, from an administrative point, kind of a no-brainer. Yes, of course you're not going to put the driveway there. That's dumb. Yes, move it here. That's fine with us. I do have sort of a concern that it can just sort of be an inflection point for litigious people. But I do like the idea of having it be very streamlined. I think that it should be sort of shoved onto the Planning Commission's consent agenda. And if there's an issue that's raised to the level, somebody can pull it and the sausage can be made to the Planning Commission instead of asking council to deal with it.
Everything has to go to council, just to be clear.
Well, yeah,
Council's never an option.
Right, but
Never
I'm
not
saying
an
that,
option.
but if it's on the consent agenda of the Planning Commission can address those issues before it ever goes to council and may may effectively make a recommendation. All right, we spent 45 minutes of planning commissioner meeting time on it. No, do with it what you will, counselor. Yeah.
If I were to like just kind of tweak or go back a little bit on what I was saying, what I would be afraid of is continuing the status quo that we have today, where somebody applies for this and it comes to planning commission, and then we're doing this trade-off condition thing that basically is the community benefits that we're trying to do. And if this is gonna tell us that our form-based code is an issue, then maybe this is, maybe that's why it's beneficial, and then we can tweak that. And that, I guess if it is discretionary and up to us, we can then review that application towards our standards, and if they actually can't meet them, then that tells us something. But I wouldn't want, my only hesitation is not to have everybody just do the special exemption as opposed to trying to meet our form-based code.
So can I jump in? So I think maybe this is my proposal, or maybe other people propose it too. I don't know. So I really see it mostly as a relief valve for the form-based code, because we don't know what aspects of it might, once it hits reality, be problematic. I don't see it as that sort of current special use permit process of effectively negotiating for things. I mean, much more, is this modification actively harmful to the community? Does it make the project, slightly better? Is it fine? Then sure, go ahead. With the goal that, if we see a lot of these, then we convert it into changes into the form-based code.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to the driveway issue, if James has 2 exceptions to where to put a driveway in a year, fine. If every 3 weeks he's tromping out to some construction site to look at why we're moving a driveway, we got a problem with our rule.
Right. And so, I do think it should be streamlined because it should be, pretty low stakes.
Driven by intent.
Is there enough glazing? Can I put this bathroom in the front of the house even though it brings me 12% above or below the active depth requirement or active use requirement instead of 10% that you can waive? And then, so streamlined, simple, not a big debate each time, and just used to create that relief valve so that we can find these problems in situations where there isn't necessarily a hardship, right? Like, there is probably not a hardship that says you absolutely can't put that extra window on the front of your house. I think there are a lot of scenarios that may or may not be hardships, and I think we're really, right now, shaping up for a lot more work for the BZA, which I think it hasn't historically seen a ton of, which is probably fine. Like 1709 JPA is a great example, right? The other day, they could have built 5 up here and 5 down here, and instead they wanted to do like 8. But that's a huge topography difference that probably would have been a textbook hardship variance. But I think there are a lot of cases like that, that just might run slightly afoul of the new form requirements, slightly beyond what can be adjusted. And some of those adjustments, just by nature, 10% or like the percentage adjustment doesn't really give you much flexibility, right? If it's 8 feet, then your adjustment is 0.8 feet, which is not a lot. Whereas, some things are like 100 feet, and then you can do a 10% adjustment, and that's a lot more powerful.
The beauty of the percentage thing, though, is when it's small numbers, it tends to be
Small product.
well, and also
Essentially.
the
Not-
small number stuff tends to also be the things that are like a side setback. Like people care a lot about those. The big number
Yeah.
things tend to have a little more leeway within them in terms of the perception or what people feel about them.
Wow, what do you think?
I'm very conflicted on this topic. I've looked at other communities that do this, And this is actually fairly common in Northern Virginia, which in general I don't consider as a best practice, and I don't consider Albemarle County as a best practice either. I think it makes sense in those contexts because the existing code is so bad, and it demands a very strong process to work around the bad code. We're trying to make good code. My current thinking is that we should make the best code we can right now, and then as we roll it out, catch the problems that we see and turn that into even better code. I think that's the right way to go.
I'm more in the camp of I think we do need to have an exception process at least for a couple of years. I know we can't sunset it, but we can always get rid of it later when we decide we don't need it. But again, just to catch the things in the code that are problematic. And again, I'm thinking again also of the JPA project. I mean, not just the height issues, but the transparency, the fact that there's a garage on the front of it, and there's no other way to put a garage there. And technically, our code says you don't have to have parking, so I don't know if that qualifies as a hardship. So because we approved that one and thought it was okay, but it pretty clearly cannot work under our proposed code.
There's that one section that says you can approve the garage entrance.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I didn't get answers to some of my questions on that, but it looked like I tried to tear it apart like any architect would to find exceptions, and I got confused more than anything. But I think we are going to find things that are buried in this code that aren't quite right, and this is a really good way of fixing those.
Yep.
Even if it means that it's going to be kind of a pain in the rear for the next couple of years for us.
Yep, so my thoughts are yes and yes. Yes on the exception process for very informed, and yes, if it goes to the planning commission in the consent agenda. So yes to streamlining if it's in our consent agenda. Okay. So we can make it right.
Well, I guess I'd say make it consent agenda if staff agrees, right?
I'm just
Like
going to say, right, if
it's
staff
bad.
agrees, right. So from a code perspective, it'll simply say that it goes to the planning commission, goes to council, right? It would be then the practice of
Right.
staff and the commission as to how we handle it.
Cool. Works.
I have a question on this item. Would this apply to affordable housing requirements?
No.
Thank you.
Form standards.
Based.
Yeah, it's strictly on form standards, yeah.
Well, I have a question for you. How do we catch those problems with the code to iterate on it if we don't have some way to know that there's some architect in some drafting office that's banging his head against the wall? I mean, I guess you might yell at James, but
So
Everyone should yell at James.
Yeah. I think the message is out. What I'd say is, I've never hesitated to entertain considering a change to a zoning ordinance where something is brought forward and we look at the issue and say, not only is this an issue here, but it's an issue more broadly, and this makes sense to address, and therefore we'll put forward to the commission and the council a change to the zoning ordinance. I think that's perfectly fair, and in fact, I hope as we're going forward with this ordinance, my expectation is to annually be bringing kind of a list of cleanup items to the commission and council to address, something that is kind of considered a best practice and I've implemented in prior communities, but also to bring things forward like when they come up.
yeah. So I guess my worry is that they won't come up in a way that they're visible unless there's a path for them to
Understand.
become visible, and then that
They only
becomes our
become
pipeline
visible
for
through me,
cleanups.
right? So
That's true, yeah.
I or my predecessor, no,
Successor.
thank you. Could say, nope, not only are we not going to consider any changes, but we're going to hide it.
Yeah, so that brings me to a related request. If you do skip the planning commission entirely, I'd like to see like a periodic, maybe annual report of like, these are the things that got exceptions.
Well, I'm going to say that I didn't hear strong support for skipping the planning commission, but maybe I missed it. But
You did that.
yeah, I did not, yeah.
Well, fair enough.
Yeah, and
It
which
could
is
apply
kind
to
of
the
checks out with
50%.
what our understanding of what our authorities are, but like I said, I thought I'd ask.
Just on that report, you could still look at the 15% administrative, because that's still in there.
Oh, that's
the
still in there,
modification.
yeah.
And
That
we
would
could
still
get a
be the
report
starting
on,
place.
yeah, we're getting these, like, everybody wants a 10% modification on their
Yep.
something.
Oh, and that's absolutely what I would use. Yeah, absolutely. And I'd note that there are conditions, right? That's not like You get a 15%. You don't. It's laid out in there how that is considered.
Sorry, is it 15 now? Because it was 10 originally, right?
It is,
Okay.
yep.
Missed that.
All right, you've got 15 more minutes. Is there any low-hanging fruit you'd like to go after?
I jotted some notes on, well, I don't know that we could, no.
Don't even want to tee it up.
I mean, we'll dig, so the next meeting, our objective is going to be to present to you guys all the questions and specific changes that you guys identified in your documents to us. Thank you for providing those. We're going to organize those and provide responses, not necessarily with the intention of discussing every one, but for you guys to pick out those that you feel you need to discuss. I also will be bringing back some language from this meeting, and then the other big topic that I don't think we can get tonight is, there were a number of questions on the ADU ordinance, affordable dwelling units, so I want to reserve some time in the next meeting for that, assuming you guys make the decision tonight not to vote a recommendation to council.
Is there any interest in talking more about the ADU stuff, or you guys want to wait till next week? Or are you not ready? If you're not ready, then...
I think broadly, what are the, I mean, I had a few things on it, but like broadly, what are the things in there that would be
Discussed.
controversial or?
I mean, I think the main question that's been raised is around the term of affordability in rental versus home ownership.
But so, yeah, the thing, we've been getting a lot of comments about that. It clearly says that you can waive that for home ownership if it serves the public purpose, which is presumably aimed at exactly what all those comments have been about. Has anyone articulated why that's not good enough?
I haven't heard that. Was that discussed with the Housing Advisory Committee?
I think that bogs things down to, every house that gets built or sold for affordable housing sale and what the resale looks like is going to.
We're only talking about what's considered under the affordable dwelling unit ordinance, right?
Yeah.
It's not a definition that it would apply to if Habitat, for example, was building a house over there on a piece of property that they own. It's not subject to the affordable dwelling unit ordinance. That wouldn't apply there.
I mean, one of the recommendations from HAC was just to take that out, just take the homeownership piece out.
Right, yeah, so I was sort of warming up to that is that just take that piece out and put in some sort of distinct, the 99-year of affordability is the issue on the home sale. It's just not a it's just not a workable way to deal with that doesn't send you sideways in a lot of, pretty fast. So the idea would be to have built into, if we're building it under affordability, that there would be a ROFR for the first arm's length, right of first refusal for the first flip of that property. So that.
And who's got that right?
So you would say it could be the city, it could be one of the providers, it could be depending on if there was money involved and from whom. And because one of the things about an affordable unit that's housing is that if you take someone who does not have a house and you put them into an affordable house that they own, you have now, that is now a family that doesn't need a unit. We're done. It's a permanent solution.
I just note that I worked on a number of inclusionary zoning ordinances that did apply in perpetuity requirement on ownership. It's not uncommon. There's ups and downs. It's simply a different philosophy in terms of are we trying to create a permanent ownership, permanently affordable ownership unit for not just that family, but the next one and the next one and the next one, or are we looking at the first family and their wealth building capacity?
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm asking. What's the point of owning a home if it's not going to be used as a foundation for building wealth?
Well, it's not that it's not that it isn't still a foundation for building wealth. They still have locked in that, they still have that unit. They've still locked in a mortgage payment that's presumably can't then be raised like rent can be raised. and they still are going to get some appreciation on it. The only thing the requirement says is that the next buyer of the house has to qualify for the affordable unit. So they have to meet the qualifications.
And when I
That-
raised this objection,
that doesn't-
Councilor Payne suggested that I take a look at the land bank land trust. How does that work here as relates to building wealth?
It's essentially the same model as a land bank, as I understand it. I'm getting out of my depth, so I don't want to go too far.
So, as I recall, having not read the agreement in a year or so, the owner can get 25% of the appreciation between the price they bought it at and the new market price. And it has to be initially listed for a homeowner at, I think, 60% AMI. And then if it doesn't sell for 90 days at that, with that restriction, that can get raised to 80% AMI, or maybe that's 80 and then 120. So presumably that kind of limits the sale price because an income qualified buyer has to be able to afford it.
Yeah.
But they're not able to capture a lot of that appreciation. I think it goes back to the land trust for them to spend.
It varies land trust by land trust, but it's shared equity, so that percentage would change based on the land trust, but it would be shared equity that goes to the next home buyer. So you pass a wealth creation opportunity to multiple families as opposed to one. That's the philosophy.
In other words, the sales price would
So it's
reflect.
limited by,
You would pass the equity on to the next person.
The next purchaser, so you
It's the
can
next
have it
purchaser.
still be-
And then a land trust model, that's doable. What I see as a problem with, qualifying subsequent buyers on this is that, first of all, 40 years from now, who knows what our wants and needs are going to be. Second, that you really are absent using a land bank or land trust or a leasehold, or even a leasehold operation to a lesser extent of any type, that in the free range world, you may be jackpotting people if the fair market value of that property is much higher. Okay, well, if you've got to keep it affordable, who's coming up with the money to make that an affordable purchase? And then how are you picking the winner and the loser on that? And that can be pretty complicated. As opposed to, this is a way of building housing that's a permanent unit that's still going to be there, and we have one bite at the apple but if the beauty of the offer is that if the market conditions have changed dramatically, that the holder of that right won't exercise it because it doesn't make sense to. So that gives you the outlet. So in other words, well, this really isn't an affordable housing issue anymore. This property is the neighborhood is like this. This is what's going on. We're not, the city, CRHA, whoever is not going to exercise this option.
so, yeah, I mean, I think the problem with that, right, is that like, you're essentially saying that the first buyer gets to buy it at X% below market as an affordable unit, and then they get that windfall of all of that appreciation goes to them, and then
Well-
that next buyer,
Not necessarily, because we don't know the purchasing configuration that is there. In other words, there may be a de facto equity share.
okay.
I mean, PHA with, for example, HAP in the county with PHA and their accruing interest, they're getting that money back for another family. I mean, the
Okay.
subsidy comes back, one way or the other, particularly if it's on title, the subsidy comes back to the offer of the subsidy because it's got to be paid at some point. I mean, unless somebody stays in there forever, it's forgivable, but unless, so. I just think it's a much more flexible way than tying ourselves to individual properties having a 99-year affordability because we're changing the ownership of those things several times. Let's talk about rental units that are there and then put people into houses in an affordable fashion.
So I guess maybe to step back from the benefit of one approach versus the other, I wonder if it matters for us, for what we're doing, to require one or the other. If the worry is that people are getting, like developers are getting the affordable housing bonus and don't, deserve it. For home ownership, they're only getting that, or they're selling it for that affordable price the first time, right? And so whatever restrictions are put on, they're still not getting anything more out of it. And so if people want to pursue one model versus the other, it's not like an unfair advantage or like a gaming of the rules. And while I kind of see seems to me like the benefits to the land trust type model, the 99-year model are better.
Well, yeah, but that would
benefit more
presuppose
families.
having the land trust there, and we don't necessarily, yes, the land trust can have its own rules about what it wants to do.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not, and the non-land trust.
We can
one.
make those decisions in who we decide to fund rather than what we
Right.
allow.
And there's a philosophy that says that you drive the period of affordability and the type of affordability by the type of money you're putting, the type of money you're putting into it, from the CAF or from somewhere else. You can, if you're going to put X number of dollars in per unit, you can say we want these to be affordable for 45 years. That's how our math works. And then this, we're giving you this much money. We want it to be affordable by this definition for 20 or whatever.
Right.
And you can make the flexibility with how much, but I think a lot of that gets driven by who subsidizes what and how.
But as far as the zoning is concerned, as long as the units are created one way or the other, I don't know that we need to care. I guess my one worry would be that some developer, sells it to his, in college 30% AM, or out of college 30% AMI kid.
Yeah,
and
well,
then
that's
they
called a
flip it.
non-arm's length transaction.
Whatever.
They're easy to catch.
Sorry,
So,
I assume we'll
whatever.
prohibit those in the manual.
sorry to butt in, but can you just refresh me where it currently is, what the flexibility is and who the decision maker is for making an exception to that? 99
Making
year.
exception to what? I'm sorry.
For the 99-year term of affordability, you mentioned that there's still an element of flexibility in terms of the zoning administrator.
It's that flexibility is granted to the zoning administrator to make the decision, to say that something's been proposed that's equivalent, effectively. That's the way it's set up right now, in the draft.
Commissioner Stolzenberg and Duranzio, I can't say I followed that conversation entirely. It's a little bit above my head, but on thinking about that, kind of benefiting home ownership over rental or making that a little more incentivizing for developers, I've thought about that, and it is not necessarily a bad thing. The more people have a buy-in into home ownership that are at lower AMIs, I don't see that as a bad thing. Let's just throw that out there. If it's a little bit more incentivizing to do the home ownership.
Well, I don't know that it is. It's just really a question of whether the first buyer gets the benefit or many buyers getting a little bit of benefit over time. But it seems to me that that it doesn't benefit the seller, the developer. And so as far as zoning is concerned, that seems like a decent reason to me to be flexible, but.
The one thing that is more kind of an economics question is if they sell it and they don't benefit, is how much can they move up the ladder if they're not capturing?
Well, I think the idea
would
is
they
you're
have
building
options,
equity, right? Even if you're not capturing all the appreciation, or maybe you're capturing some appreciation, but not all.
Yeah, but again, I think that I think the long-term affordability on the homeownership in sort of this arbitrary way puts the thumb on the scale in ways that we don't even really, I hesitate to look at the ramifications, and I'm glad James has got experience in managing those programs. I just think that that it's creating. Yeah, I mean, the equity appreciation is a big deal. I mean, I think that needs to be recaptured by the provider before that person takes a profit. But that's done by the subsidy being a lien. And I think a lot of that is more easily handled by who's giving the subsidy and by how much, and determining that way.
Just note on the notion with inclusionary zoning, with the ADU ordinance, is that it's internally subsidized by the project. As is noted in one of the messages we just got, right? The notion is that the subsidy is not coming from the city, the subsidy is coming from the other market rate units.
Oh, I'm talking about
Project.
I'm talking about SFRs and townhomes at this point.
Maybe. For the R zone bonus, we gave no actual financial incentive for it, right?
No, that's true.
So it's, well, if you feel like you're a good person, you can give a
Right.
lot to Habitat or the land trust or give it to them for
Sure.
a low price.
Yeah,
So
the way we
actually,
have it,
though,
it's
that
not being
probably-
recaptured by the provider. It's given to the city's affordable, yeah.
Sure, understand. I'm guess I'm thinking about the 10 units and greater, 60% of MI, 10% of units.
Well, I mean, on the
That's what I was
rental
thinking
side, yeah, but those would be presumably rentals.
Maybe.
Always,
Yeah, well, and then we can have a method of converting, and, if they condoize the building, we can put in methodologies to deal with that. Again, not in zoning.
So your concern is on the 100% affordability bonus in the RABC.
No, my concern is on the required length of affordability period for home ownership.
So it prohibits the Habitat model, and it arguably prohibits the land trust model because they're only 80 years. And by prohibit, I mean it says when a project demonstrates the affordability goals of the comp plan and affordable housing plan and the intent of the section are met, James can change it. Which presumably means he will allow Habitat to continue to exist. So, that seems like enough to me, but.
Yeah, I think that making the model of how a lot of affordable homes, and of course, yeah, of how affordable homes for ownership get pushed out into the community, I think it essentially relies on the benevolence of the zoning administrator. And, who knows what James's successor will be like. I mean, the committee that recommended his hiring was full of people of incredibly good judgment. That may not be true in the future. So I just think we ought to bifurcate them. I'm fine with the 99 on the rentals, primarily because it pencils easily for people who are doing it. You just have to refinance your own LIHTC.
And I'm with you, Phil. I'd like to just see it taken out for ownership. But
Do you strongly object to changing that?
no.
Well,
Yeah,
I guess we're going to have,
my view is that
I guess
doesn't
we're going to have this
matter.
conversation, the part 2 and 3 of this conversation next week.
I just hope, well, I would hope that we don't fill up a ton of time next week with this.
No.
how do you guys feel, Mr. Schwartz? You want in or out?
As far as this topic,
Home ownership.
I'm not really. This is not my expertise. But I hear the argument for getting rid of the 99 years, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I lean towards 99 years being a better model. I don't think we need to require it. I think the fact that we're going into this saying we know that we are going to do these waivers all the time because we know that we think the Habitat model is good enough for this. Maybe we should just go ahead and change it to stop the headache of it.
Mr. Solich.
The process improvement expert, to the extent that I am one, says yes, as much as possible, we should consider the expected uses and find a way in our process to make that clear and simple, so that it, just for many reasons, just to inform people trying to make things happen, the public who are trying to understand what's going on, and staff who are trying to make it go.
The consensus seems to be to take it out.
Yeah. To be clear, like, you asked me whether it would be bother me, and it doesn't bother me. My concern has been the statement made repeatedly that this is impossible, that it doesn't work, that it doesn't belong in zoning, and those are all clearly false. So I didn't want anyone to be swayed by that. It's simply a policy decision. Which way do we guys want to go? You guys have made a decision, and I appreciate it.
I think you should make the argument of the benefits of the 99-year thing when it comes to CAF allocations,
Sure.
which is not to us.
Yep.
Is the commission ready to make a recommendation to council? Mr. Schwartz?
No, I do not believe we are. So I would move that we table this meeting and reconvene at the next scheduled work session.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? Any negative? Right. Mr. Durante, you want to do your thing?
Sure. So I move we adjourn, and in doing so, I would urge you all to answer aye, because after all, today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
And we are adjourned.
Oh, no second? All right.
Second.
We're adjourned.
Our